Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for registering to this webinar on modeling disease progression for GNE myopathy. I would like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the EURO-NMD website and also on the EURO-NMD YouTube channel. I am Michele Onali and I will be moderating this webinar today. I am a rare disease and GNE myopathy patient representative, and I'm also a member of the patient advisory board at EURO-NMD. Today we have the big pleasure to have with us Melanie Quintana, Director and Senior Statistical Scientist at Berry Consultants in the US, where she designs Bayesian adaptive clinical trials across therapeutic areas and complex clinical questions in rare and progressive diseases. So today, Melanie will present a disease progression model which can be applied to muscle diseases with prospectively collected muscle strength data. We will further explore challenges and complexity in GNE myopathy, but that can be encountered in other rare diseases as well. First and foremost, GNE myopathy is a muscle disease, slowly progressive. It's a rare disease with a prevalence of 1 to 6 in 1 million in the world. So we will definitely explore challenges like rare incidence of the disease, heterogeneity in progression and onset of the disease, and the fact that chronological age is not a predictor of disease age and stage in GNE myopathy. So following that, Melanie will present how we can overcome these complexities through innovative designs and powerful analysis methods. So I would say I would turn it over to you now, Melanie. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today. We are looking forward to your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for inviting me here to present. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with everybody. Okay, can everyone see that? The slides okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, and thanks again for inviting me. This has been it's a pleasure to speak on something that we've worked a really long time on, and I tend to at Berry Consultants I design innovative clinical trials. The company as a whole, we design adaptive and innovative clinical trials. My area of expertise tends to be in rare diseases and trying to better understand disease progression and progressive diseases. And this was one of the first projects that I got involved in at Berry Consultants almost 8 years ago now. So it's really one of my favorite projects that I've worked on while here. So the first thing I want to discuss and just talk about is what I actually mean by a disease progression model in GNE myopathy. So when we started this project, we kind of brainstormed, and after hearing a bit about the disease, we kind of went to the chalkboard and drew this picture. This was our goal picture. If we could somehow, categorize across the whole spectrum of the disease, how do the muscles kind of decline over the course of the disease, and how do they move relative to one another? How quickly do they move? At what time point do they start to decay? And this is really our goal picture, to be able to make and understand how each muscle moves as a function of disease stage. In general, these disease progression models are just, some mathematical function. It can really be anything that allows us to quantitatively capture that individual disease evolution. So some way to quantify how a participant moves throughout the course in the disease. And this can be measured really with a single measurement. We've done these in dominantly inherited Alzheimer's, where we look at just a single sort of cognitive score, or it can be multiple disease specific biomarkers. So here in GNE myopathy, we're going to look at multiple muscle groups and how those sort of decline over time relative to one another. And another thing I'll say is, in progressive diseases like GNE myopathy, these functions are likely monotonic. And that just means that once an individual begins to progress, they'll continue progressing, and we don't expect to see any improvements thereafter. And I know we had a bit of an introduction to GNE myopathy. Again, it's just a very rare genetic muscle disease. These are several images of individuals with GNE myopathy looking at their muscles and how those atrophy over time. And very slowly progressive muscle weakness and atrophy. It can differ by patient, but it does tend to start in the dorsiflex or the ankle, where an individual may begin noticing that they're tripping because they're not able to lift their foot properly and use that ankle muscle. And when we were brought into this project, the goal really was to be able to understand the disease well enough so that we could design a clinical trial to test novel therapies. So come up with the best possible clinical trial, the most efficient clinical trial that would be able to enroll a broad amount of individuals, but still be very efficient and feasible in terms of recruitment rates, given that this is such a rare disease. So our goals really were sort of threefold. These are our main goals: is to first just understand the disease. How does that disease progress across multiple endpoints, mostly the muscle scores? And then once we had a good understanding of this, determine which of these endpoints would be best to capture disease progression and ultimately to quantify potential disease modification due to a treatment. And then finally, to be able to predict future patient-specific disease courses. So to really be able to understand, given a disease stage of an individual patient, where do we expect them to go next? What do we expect to happen over the next 10 years, and predict where you think that they will go over the course of their disease. And I'll say the key to all of this, and I really think the key to clinical trial design, and especially rare diseases where we have such limited patient resources, is running good prospective natural history studies. And we were really blessed to work with the NIH. And we actually were contacted by the NIH to work on this project and work with them. And they had a very rich natural history study that they were running. They were enrolling many patients at the time that I'm reporting these summaries here. This was during when we created our publication, and it was back in April 2016. So this is just a snapshot. This is still going. This is a very, very rich database of individuals with GNE myopathy. The visits are occurring every 3 to 6 months. During this snapshot, the average follow-up was around 14 months, and we had some individuals with just baseline measures, but others with all the way out to 38 months of follow-up. And the group at the NIH collected many different measurements because, again, the goal was to understand disease progression and what is really the best endpoint to use in a future clinical trial. So they collected 6-minute walk tests, which does tend to be the standard in progressive diseases to use as clinical trial endpoints, although we know that this is not always the best since it can have lots of variability. The AMAT, which is a myopathy assessment tool, the HAP, which is a human activity profile, IBM FRS, which we'll show you in a little bit, kind of rating scales, how well do you dress yourself? Can you climb stairs? Things like that. And then finally, the thing that we'll focus on the most, which is the QMA, or the quantitative muscle assessment. And this was measured for multiple muscle groups. This is just a picture of an individual performing the QMA. This is really to show and to get a sense that this is quite an objective measure. This machine is used to measure how much force is exuded when you use that muscle, and it's measured in kilograms. So this is an example of what some of that data might look like. And also to show you that we take those kilograms for each muscle group and convert it to what's called a percent predicted, percent of normal strength, what would be the strength measured in a healthy individual of the same age, gender, and BMI. So you can see here for left and right grip, the kilograms tend to be around 40, 45 kilograms of strength used when using that muscle. And that tends to be around normal for someone of the same age, gender, and BMI, around 80 to 90%. Whereas the dorsiflex, as we mentioned before, the dorsiflex is one of the first muscles to deteriorate and that's measured more at about 7 to 8 kilograms, and the percent predicted was around 25%. So you can see already evidence here that those muscles are beginning to atrophy. Similarly with perhaps the knee extension, and subtly up here in some of the elbow flexion and elbow extension as well. So this is what some of this QMA data looks like if you haven't seen it before and you're not familiar with that data. This is some of that data plotted for 4 individuals within the natural history study. What I have here is muscle strength, or percent predicted muscle strength. So for a healthy individual of the same age, gender, and BMI, you would kind of just expect to see this at 1 and stay at 1. Although we know that there's variability in how strong different individuals are, but you would expect that to kind of be at 1 and stay at 1 for a healthy individual. Here I have chronological age, so that these are the longitudinal measurements over time of individuals for 6 key muscle groups that we study. We study the knee flexion, which is the hamstring, ankle dorsiflexion, ankle, knee extension, which is the quadricep, grip, shoulder abduction, and elbow flexion. And so you can see for the first individual here, their knee flexion and ankle dorsiflexion, those 2 lines are kind of on top of each other. Those have completely declined, almost 0% strength on those. And this individual is actively declining on the upper extremities. So grip, shoulder abduction, and elbow flexion. And this individual was 30 years old at baseline, and we've been following them for about 2 years at this point in time. You can compare that to participant B, who still has a good deal of strength left on the knee flexion. The most actively progressing muscle is that dorsiflexion, going from about 50% strength to below 25% over this 2 years, but quite different in terms of the disease stage. And this gets back to the original comment that chronological age is not a great predictor of disease stage in this disease. These 2 individuals are around the same age, but very different disease stages. Participant C looks quite similar to A, again, almost fully declined on knee flexion and ankle dorsiflexion, and actively declining on the upper extremities. And participant D, I put in here, just very interesting because they look quite strong on all the muscles except for the dorsiflex. So this is just to show individual patient variability, that we need to account for. Some individuals are just stronger than others on average, and the fact that perhaps there could be some injury that caused the ankles to deteriorate faster than what would be expected for this individual. So really the goal of disease progression models, these disease progression models, is you can think of these as each of these individuals and all of the individuals in the natural history database provide a small snapshot of this very slowly progressive disease that can be categorized over 50 years perhaps. So just looking at 2 years of the disease tends to just be a very small snapshot. However, if we can take all of those snapshots and put them together and align them, think of them as pieces of the puzzle, put them together, then we can get a better understanding of what the whole disease course looks like. So that's really our goal here, and that's really our challenge, is how do we align these individuals? Where do they fit into the puzzle in terms of this disease? And so we can actually use the data itself to help us align these individuals, fit them where we think they are in the disease course given their observed data. So as we mentioned, both A and C kind of look quite similar to one another. We think they're actively progressing on the upper extremities and have completely progressed on the lowers. So they're probably later disease stage. Maybe A was a little bit later than C because C still has some knee flexion and is a little bit higher on the upper extremities. B and D both kind of still had some strength on either the upper extremities or in their dorsiflex. We actually estimated that D probably had some weakness for other reasons in their dorsiflex, so we adjust them based on on what we believe is their max strength, and they get shifted over to the left here. So the model kind of simultaneously tries to figure out where individuals are in the disease course, shift them left and right, and then fit overall pictures of disease progression. And this does this with uncertainty. You know, we don't just say, okay, I think this person is absolutely negative 10 years on the disease age. What the model does is kind of iterates through fitting them where we think they are, building the curves, fitting them, building the curves. And we do this iteratively until we find sort of the best fit for all of this data. So this is just a little bit of the math behind that. That was kind of just meant to give you a broad intuition behind what we're doing with these disease progression models. But a little bit more of the math behind it is that we are taking, think of the Y's as the observed data. So this is subject specific, visit specific, and muscle specific. And so this is a joint model across multiple muscles, and it's a repeated measures model. So we look at the longitudinal data of each individual, and we assume that those measurements are normal with some mean, and I'll explain that in a second, and some variance. And we assume that the variance is a function of the mean, because what we have observed and what others have observed is at full strength, the variability can be a bit higher than when an individual has progressed. So if you have a good deal of strength, then there might be a good amount of variability. You know, on a good day, you could do 10 kilograms better than on a bad day. Once you start to lose that strength, you know, there isn't a lot of variability around the measurements. Maybe we're talking 1 or 2 kilograms. So we want to be able to model that, that it's known that the variance can be a function of your expected value. The mean itself is made up of several components. The first component is this muscle specific location parameter that says, when does a muscle start to decline in terms of disease age? Also, this beta parameter is a muscle specific slope parameter. So how quickly does that muscle decline once it starts declining? This parameter here, Tij, is the chronological age for that individual at visit J. The alpha I is the shifting parameter. This is the parameter where we're trying to fit the different pieces of the puzzle together. So this determines an individual's quote unquote disease age, where we shift them left and right to really try to understand where they are in the course of the disease. And then finally, this is the parameter that I alluded to earlier. This is to account for the fact that individuals may just have different relative maximums for each of their muscles. So some individuals may be stronger or weaker than others on each of those muscles, and we try to account for that as well. So this is just the knee flexion data, one of the muscles, just to give you, again, a good idea of what we're trying to do here. So this is, again, versus chronological age. We have the participants A, B, C, and D plotted here as well. And then once our model is run, I'm now plotting the mean estimates for a subject's disease age. So I shift them left and right based on our best guess where they are in terms of the course of their disease. And then I fit the curve. And one thing to say is you can do this however you wanted. We decided to anchor our model, so we defined disease age 0 to be when knee flexion is at 50%. And that's just a way to define and understand what 0 means. We could have easily chosen, you know, disease age 0 was when it's 80%. And it's just the shift of the curve in a renaming of disease age. But just to orient everyone, disease age 0 is defined by 50% knee flexion. And so this helps us to anchor ourselves and really understand how the muscles kind of move in synergy to one another and relative to one another. And so now this is not just knee flexion, but all of the muscles plotted against our estimated disease stage for each individual. What we can see is that ankle dorsiflexion at disease age 0, when knee flexion is at 50%, tends to be at about 4%. And ankle dorsiflexion reached its 50th percentile about 7.7 years before knee flexion did. So ankle dorsiflexion, we're estimating, is really the first muscle to deteriorate and then knee flexion. Afterwards, we see shoulder abduction that happens about 2.6 years after knee flexion, then shoulder extension, and then, elbow flexion, and then grip, which happens about 10.6 years after knee flexion. One thing to note here is that the knee extension never quite reaches its 50th percentile and stays relatively flat. And so when we showed these results to our clinical collaborators, they said this had a lot of face validity to it, in that this originally was known as the quadriceps sparing disorder, and that individuals would still have some amount of strength over the entire course of their disease and in their quadriceps. So this was quite expected, that the knee extension would decline somewhat, but remain relatively flat. And this is just an overall picture, that goal picture that we wrote on the chalkboard when we started this project, of what we really wanted to be able to understand how the muscles kind of move relative to one another. And I think in this picture, you can really see that the most quickly progressing muscles tend to be the ankle dorsiflexion, the knee flexion, and the elbow flexion. Those progress most rapidly, and it tends to be first ankle dorsiflexion, then knee flexion, and then elbow flexion. Shoulder abduction and the grip tend to progress a bit more slowly, and they may have started progressing earlier on in the disease, but they don't really reach their 50th percentile until later on. And this also, you can see that the lower extremities tend to progress first, and then the upper extremities we see here as well. So again, I mentioned at the beginning that our goal was not just to understand this disease in general, but to be able to understand for individual participants where we think they'll be going over the next, say, 10 years. And this had many benefits to it. It allowed us to communicate this with individual patients, where we think they are in the disease course, give them expectations for how we think their disease would progress. But you'll also see that this helps us in terms of future clinical trials. So if we're able to predict future progression, given natural progression without any treatment, then we could, and if we give an individual treatment, say we gave a participant B a treatment at 32 years old, and then we observed what happened. And let's say their dorsiflex kind of stayed above this line and kind of stayed right around 20%. That would be strong evidence that this treatment was really benefiting this individual, because their observed values on treatment were well above, say, the prediction interval and what was predicted given the natural course of the disease. So these subject level predictions really are beneficial to us to be able to do this in our model. And what you can see here is that what muscle groups are going to actively progress really depends on the disease stage of the individual. So participant B, who's earlier on in the disease, we expect them to most actively progress on both dorsiflex and knee flex, whereas participant A and C, we expect them to progress most actively on knee extension, the upper extremities, grip, shoulder abduction, and elbow flexion. So again, I think in terms of thinking about clinical trials, this also shows that a single endpoint is not going to work for all individuals. So if we would have just perhaps chose a 6-minute walk, for instance, participant A and C would be probably pretty declined already on that 6-minute walk test, and it wouldn't capture this actively declining in where we think we could actually get a benefit from in the upper extremities. Whereas if we chose something like upper extremity composite score, participant B, we would be missing out on the fact that we really think this participant could benefit the most in their lower extremities where they're currently actively progressing. So this gets to what we're going to talk about in a little bit, that really a single measure, if we want to enroll a broad patient population, will not accurately capture all participants and be best for all participants. When we did all of this work, we still wanted to sort of back up and make sure that our work had face validity. And so our best way to do that was to take some of the other measures that were measured in the natural history study and see how well they correlate with disease age that we've estimated from our model. So remember that this disease age estimate was just based on the QMA measurements. It wasn't 6-minute walk didn't go into the model, you know, all of these functional tests did not go into the model, but we wanted to see, okay, now that we have this disease age estimated just from QMA, how does it correlate with these other measurements that we have on these individuals? And what you can see here is that, as was alluded to earlier, chronological age is not a great predictor of these measures. It doesn't correlate very well with where you are on these measures. Disease duration, which is essentially based on an estimate to how long the participant has had the disease, when the participant believes their onset was and their current age. And that correlates a little bit better than chronological age, but still not great, you'll see. But then you can see disease age has a great amount of correlation with all of these other measurements that weren't placed into the model themselves. Obviously, these first three are composites of the QMA, so those are going to have some of the strongest correlations. But you also see, for instance, with 6-minute walk, very strong correlation across the board, you know, very strong correlations with our estimated disease age and other measures. And here's just some plots of that. This is the different domains in the IBM-FRS. And so here you can see climbing stairs. We've plotted sort of observed values on this, measurement as a function of estimated disease age. And then we kind of have a heat map here to see how we think individuals will progress on this measure over the course of the disease. And so even at the very beginning, we think individuals tend to be slow, intermittent use of handrails for the first, say, 10 years in the disease. At disease age 0, which remember we defined as when knee flexion was at 50th percentile, individuals kind of shift over to being more dependent on the handrail when climbing stairs. And then about 25 years later, we think they'll need additional support. And then quickly thereafter, they'll be unable to climb stairs on their own. Similarly, we see the same sort of picture with walking, starting out with slow or mild unsteadiness, then needing a device. And then about 25 years after, you know, intermittent use of device, they'll be completely dependent on that device. So you can see the same sort of pictures for the lower extremities. You can also, I think these pictures show why this tool might not be the best in terms of using it, say, for a clinical trial to assess if a treatment actually works, because many of the domains we don't see much movement on, especially in the upper extremities. So some of these individuals can remain quite normal over the entire course of the disease, and really only towards the end do they become impaired on these measurements. And this is just putting all of that information together, the QMA, and then all of the summaries. And really, we're able, using disease age as an anchor, we're able to understand sort of the whole picture of the disease and what we expect. So here at disease age 0, when you're sort of actively progressing on the hamstring and the shoulder abduction, ankle is almost completely progressed. That corresponds to sort of intermittent use of handrail when climbing the stairs, mild unsteadiness when walking, needing to use substitute motions when standing from sitting. The 6-minute walk test was approximately 450 meters for these individuals. And on the AMAT, they were still a high functioning group. You can compare that to 20 years later, where individuals tend to be almost completely progressed on many of the muscle groups, still some strength and then the extension as expected and the grip, But at this point, they would require the use of their arms and standing from sitting, slow, fine motor tasks, only about 230 meters, being able to walk in 6 minutes, but several participants are unable to complete this. And the AMAT was a low functioning group for these individuals. So we're able, again, using disease age to get an entire picture of the disease and really understand it as a whole. So at this point, I'll kind of shift gears to the original question, which was, how can we design the most efficient clinical trial to understand if the treatment actually modifies this disease progression? And how can we use all of this information that we learned to design this trial in a way that we can enroll a broad patient group and have a good amount of power with a feasible sample size in this population? So the first place to start is to really understand what's the best primary endpoint to use in a clinical trial. And I've talked about this a little bit already, but I'll just go over it a little bit more. Essentially what that means in a progressive disease is that we want to choose an endpoint that's most sensitive to disease progression. We want to pick the endpoints that have the highest rate of decline and the lowest variability. And of course, there are other key considerations, and some of these are very important. Are these endpoints clinically meaningful? We want to make sure they're meaningful to the participants. Are these endpoints well accepted by regulatory agencies? And would demonstration of slowing of progression on these endpoints provide evidence of treatment efficacy? So we need to keep this in consideration. Here's one of those endpoints, 6-minute walk test. And here I've just kind of plotted the longitudinal trajectories of the different individuals over the course of follow-up. And you can see, if anyone's, for all those familiar with this test, as expected, large amount of variability in how much individuals could walk at baseline, and very minimal decline over even, say, 3 years in the trial. You don't see too much progression over the course of this endpoint. So lots of variability and sort of slow rates of progression. And what that translates to is for say a treatment that could reduce decline by, let's say, 50%. So a treatment that slows disease progression by 50%, we would need close to 1,200 participants to have 80% power for a 1-year study if we use this endpoint, and 300 participants for a 2-year study if we use this endpoint. So really, these are not feasible numbers in GNE myopathy. Here's another endpoint that I'll show you that we looked at, and you'll see why I'm showing this very specific endpoint in a moment, but this was the upper extremity QMA composite score. So it took all of those upper extremities that we're measuring on the QMA and added them together. Again, lots of variability on how individuals could do at baseline, very slow sort of progression, although a bit more than we saw on 6-minute walk test. And here, what this comes out to be is that you would need about 468 individuals for a 1-year study if you use this endpoint, 120 individuals for a 2-year study, which is becoming slightly more feasible, but still a little bit hard to enroll about 120 individuals in this very rare disease. And you'll see I've circled this for a reason, and also put power for, say, a study of size 80. We expect that to be about 21%. And the reason that I've circled this and showed you this endpoint is that in August 22nd, 2017, Ultragenyx gave their top line results from their phase 3 study. And this is the endpoint that they used. It was based on results from a phase 2 study that they saw. And this was the most promising endpoint that they saw in that phase 2 study. But as you can see, and as you saw, given the information that we had from the natural history study, we predicted that this endpoint in a study of, say, 80 individuals, they enrolled 89, would be very underpowered to show a benefit, even in a treatment that would slow disease by about 50%. And it was announced that the study did in fact not meet its primary endpoint. So I just give this example to say that I do believe that rich natural history studies where we can really understand potential endpoints, especially in rare diseases where we may only get one chance to study a treatment, are invaluable. We should really be considering running these nice prospective natural history studies to understand these endpoints in all rare diseases. And this is a summary of all the endpoints that we had in the natural history study, just showing what sample size we would need for a 2-year study, given different endpoints. The best one, so the one that had the most highest rate of progression and lowest variability, would be the AMAT total score. And so we estimated that individuals would decline about 1.5 points per year, and the standard deviation of that was 2.5, and that resulted in a sample size needed of about 96 participants. So in summary, what we saw when we just kind of looked at very traditional approaches to clinical trials is that no single endpoint provided the sensitivity needed to run a feasible trial. So here we are looking to run a trial of about 50 participants, and all of these single endpoints would have been underpowered in a clinical trial with 50 participants, unless we saw an enormous treatment benefit. So perhaps a benefit where we completely are able to stop disease progression. It was also determined that QMA was the most direct measure of disease progression and the one that was most clinically meaningful to individuals. This disease is muscle weakness, so being able to measure and assess muscle strength and determine if there's a slowing in the progression of muscle weakness was really one of the most important measures. So QMA came to the top in terms of what's the most important measures in these buckets. So the question kind of became, how can we actually use this GNE disease progression model to assess if a treatment is working or not? Can we use this joint model that we've built where we sort of adjust for a disease stage of different individuals to actually determine if a treatment works? So to give you a little intuition behind this and why we think it's a good idea, if we are able to use this GNE disease progression model to study a treatment, we believe it would provide us with more powerful analysis tools because we're able to predict and understand sort of disease stage. And so this is just a plot. This is the exact same data of muscle strength for one of the muscle groups as a function of length of follow-up. And you can see looks highly variable here, and it's hard to picture anything in this data. But when we adjust for disease stage, we can see that we eliminate a lot of that variability and a more clear picture comes about. So just by adjusting for where we think individuals are in their disease course, we can eliminate a lot of that variability. And what does this allow us to do? This allows us to increase our ability to differentiate variability in natural progression versus treatment-related disease modification. So this individual here who's plotted in blue, if I look at them just on this plot, it's really hard to determine, is this individual progressing as we would expect under natural progression, or is there evidence for some slowing in disease progression? But when I look at them on this plot, when I adjust for disease stage, when I adjust for where I think they would go under natural progression, given their current disease stage, you can clearly see that they're rising above that the values tend to be higher than what we would expect over natural progression. So again, this is just to give you some intuition behind why we think being able to adjust for disease stage in a primary analysis method to test a treatment will give us a lot of power. And this is, again, is just to show you the math behind it, how we introduce that treatment effect into our GNE disease progression model. Here we introduce this slowing, 4% slowing in the rate of decline across all muscle groups. So this is assumed to be common across all muscle groups. This is not assumed to be an absolute delta that's common across time. So we don't say, for instance, that across time, we expect the treatment to be different from control by, say, 20% across time. It's a slowing parameter. So as time goes on, what we tend to see is that the delta between, say, a 70% reduction, so a gamma of 0.3 would be a 70% reduction, And so the delta between normal progression and a treatment with a 70% reduction would be bigger as time goes on than at the beginning. And it also would depend on where you currently are in that muscle group. So for instance, if you're given a treatment and you look just on dorsiflex and dorsiflex is almost completely declined, then you don't expect to have much power to differentiate even a total cure from natural progression. But if you look, for instance, at a muscle that's not completely declined yet, or you give the treatment a little bit earlier, you can see you'll have a lot of power to differentiate between these different treatment effects and natural progression. So this just also shows that being able to put in all of these muscles into our primary analysis and do a joint analysis of these muscle groups allows us to use the muscle where we can best detect a treatment effect for each subject. So this, in some ways, is allowing the participants to have their own participant-specific muscle that's contributing the most to the treatment effects. Muscles that aren't expected to decline would not contribute very much, but those who are actively declining would contribute more. So that's another reason why we believe that using this GNE disease progression model would give us a lot of power. And this is just to give you some intuition behind what do I mean by a 50% slowing? What would that actually mean clinically? This is for that disease age individual about 8 years from when we think their knee flex will be at 50%. So an early disease age individual, we think that they're going to actively progress under natural progression to almost zero on their dorsiflex over the next, say, 7 years. And if we gave them a treatment that reduced disease progression by 50%, instead of 7 years that it would take to go from 20% to zero on dorsiflexion, that would now be 14 years. So you can see that this is the same as thinking of a 50% slowing would essentially mean it would take you 2 times longer to get to these different stages of the disease. So if we look down here, the ability to climb stairs, this individual would start to depend more on the handrail, we estimate in about 8 years at age 40. But if they are given a treatment with a 50% reduction in decline, this would now be 16 years away at age 48. And similar for ability to walk, they would need to intermittently use an ambulatory device 10 years from now under natural progression, and that would be more like 20 years from now if they were given this treatment. So this is just to give you some intuition and understanding of what this 50% slowing would actually mean. So finally, results from the actual clinical trial that we've designed, and it is a clinical trial that I believe is going to be enrolling any moment. So this trial is going to enroll individuals who are 51 individuals, randomized 2-to-1 treatment to control, so randomize more participants to treatment than control, 2 years of follow-up, and we're powering on this 50% slowing in disease progression. And what we saw from all of those other endpoints that we looked at in very traditional analysis methods, we would only have about 10 to 40% power if we used any single endpoint or very traditional analysis method. But what we estimated using our joint disease progression model, which is actually the primary analysis that will be used in this trial, that we have over 90% power to detect a 50% slowing in progression. So very highly powered just by jointly using all of the muscle groups and adjusting for disease stage. So I think I'll stop here, and just in summary, the main points that I hope you'll take with you, not just for GNE myopathy, but other rare diseases and other progressive diseases, is that understanding disease progression in terms of whatever sort of modeling you might do, together with natural history studies, is really invaluable. This allows more informed decision making, and this allows us to design clinical trials that can be as efficient as possible and can enroll a broad patient population. Using these sort of disease progression models allows us to capture many aspects of the disease at different varying stages, not just a single one. So not just capture the lower extremities using 6-minute walk. We can capture multiple aspects of the disease. We can adjust for natural rate of progression. And we can do this instead of having to enrich to include only those individuals likely to decline. So this allows us to, again, enroll that broad patient population, which is extremely important in rare diseases. We don't want to have to make a rare disease even more rare by including only individuals we predict will progress. And then finally, I'll give a word of caution is that, when building these models, we need to work closely with clinicians, and I'll say also patients as well. We need to make sure that what's going into the modeling is important and meaningful, and that the outputs are clinically meaningful, that our results actually match what patients are feeling and what clinicians are seeing. So work closely with clinicians when doing this to really get a good understanding of everything. And I'll leave you with just a couple of references. The top is this disease progression model itself, so explaining that in statistics and medicine. And then I put 2 more on here. That we used a similar type of model in dominantly inherited Alzheimer's, a rare genetic version of Alzheimer's, and those describe that method as well. So I will stop sharing here, maybe leave this up and answer any questions.
Thank you, Melanie. Really a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. You brought up actually very important points, not only for GNE myopathy, but also for many rare diseases, of course. First and foremost, that we want, of course, to understand the individual patient living with the disease. And we want, of course, the therapy possibly to work for all. And GNE myopathy is definitely a big example in this. We are extremely heterogeneous, and we want, of course, the therapy to work for all. So normally in literature, you can say that you find for sure that GNE myopathy starts more or less in the age between 20 and 30 years old. But as a community, we can even say we may have patients starting the first symptoms as early as 15 or as late as 40. So it's very important that the design of the trial indeed looks at the globality of patients. Thank you very much. So I was wondering if anyone would have just a question for Melanie. You can, I believe, Antonio, they can unmute themselves, right?
Exactly. Everybody is about to talk now. I can start. Usually people shy off. We have great attendance today, including Professor Argov. So, and not only, but namely Professor Argov. Melanie, thank you very much. You gave me the complete illusion that I understood what you were talking about. I know it's just an illusion, but it's still a very nice one. I think that now that you've stopped talking, I'm back to my normal dumb self, but I would like to ask you about the determination of the 0 point at the disease age variable, because it seems a bit conventional and I didn't understand how that relates to the progression of the disease. So if I understand correctly, for GNE is the 50% point for the knee flexion. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And that really can be defined any way we wanted it to. It's just a reference point. So it would just shift the labels. It was just change the labels on the x-axis essentially.
So if you allow me another stupid question, why doesn't the 0 point coincide with the 0 of the axis, of the x-axis?
Oh, okay. So why didn't we have knee flexion be at 0 when you were at disease age 0? I mean, I think you can do this many ways. Actually, if I were doing it again, I would probably try to elicit what clinicians feel is defined as quote unquote onset. And I would have defined disease age 0 as onset, so that it kind of is years from onset or years to onset. We chose knee flexion at 50% just because we're able to estimate that quite nicely. And we had a lot of individuals within that range. So that's kind of why we chose that. But yeah, I think if I was doing it again, I would shift it over a little bit so that 0 was onset, or at least closer to onset, whatever that we thought that meant.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question for Melanie? Exactly, don't be shy.
So since people are still not very courageous, can I ask you another thing, Melanie? So that logistic curve, it's more or less a common feature to any progression of any muscular disease that is characterized by muscle weakness. I understand that it can be steeper or more less steeper, so it can have different slopes and probably different durations of each phase to call it that. But can we hope that every muscle disease in a way will have such a profile at the end in terms of muscle weakness?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're hitting on, we presented this nice, clean picture, but this was probably part of the first couple of years really looking at the data and seeing what parametric model we thought fit the data quite nicely. I will say that in a lot of progressive diseases, this kind of fits the bill, and you can see, you can get different shapes, but it tends to be, you have a ceiling, and then you have some sort of progression, and then you have the floor. So this tends, I think, this logistic curve tends to fit quite nicely to a lot of diseases. If you look at our publication in dominantly inherited Alzheimer's, actually, we have a completely non-parametric curve there. So it's almost like a spline curve in that you have different buckets and people can progress differently in each bucket. But for us in GNE myopathy, these curves tended to fit very, very nicely, and we didn't see the need to go sort of more non-parametric.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
My name is Orgov. I'm happy to see the results, especially with the quadriceps sparing that I was first to report ages ago. My main question is, you base your data and the 0 point on a percentage of normal values. And how do you correct for the high variability in normal people for each muscle strength between a normal person who runs every day to a normal person who hardly moves from his chair?
Yeah, that is twofold, or estimated within the model itself. So that's a parameter that we estimate, sort of this M was a maximum muscle strength for each individual. And that is, it's what we call a hierarchical model, so that within a subject, we assume that the maximum strength across the different muscle groups will be quite similar. So you could say, this M is 2 times. So this individual is 2 times as strong as other individuals on average across all muscle groups, but then the muscle groups themselves can differ. So we have sort of what we call this hierarchical model, where you have an overall mean saying overall you're 2 times stronger, but some muscles could be worse or better. So we try to estimate that from the model itself.
Well, where do you take the basic data from normal?
Oh, where do we get the model to get that original, convert the kilograms to
convert the percent of normal, because normal is very wide range.
Yeah, I think we use, and the clinicians would speak better to this, but we use publications where different linear models were fit to these QMA measurements, and they came up with different models and expected values for someone of the same age, gender, and BMI.
So Jean-Yves Auquel is online, so if you want to talk about that, perhaps he's specialist on the area.
Well, thank you to give me the opportunity to take it. I don't have a particular question. I find this approach very elegant. I was just wondering how a different model would fit the data, or if another model could fit better the data and to reach different conclusions. So the choice of the model is a very strong hypothesis. Is it true, Melanie, or I'm wrong?
Yeah, I think, you know, the choice of, we did do a good amount, and I didn't present those results here, to look at, you know, different choices of parametric declines for the different muscle groups, you know, different, this is a Bayesian model. So we define prior distributions for all parameters. So we tried to look at sensitivity of our results to different assumptions. We haven't presented it here, but the results do tend to be quite insensitive to several things. Some of the parameters we do have to elicit pretty strong prior beliefs. For instance, we can't have too much in what I was showing in terms of that maximum muscle strength that we estimate for each individual. We can't allow that to be too different from normal, or the model itself just you wouldn't be able to determine the difference between someone just being stronger than average versus are they actually at a lower disease age. So some of those, some parameters were quite results were sensitive to what we did in terms of the prior distributions there, just solely because if you don't put in informative priors there, you can get really poor behavior and not be able to identify different parameters. But I would say the model results as a whole, in terms of the big picture, tend to be pretty insensitive to different choices on, say, the mean functions and things like that as well. And I'll also say that I think, again, you know, showing that these correlations that we had with the other outcome measures provided a lot of face validity to our results, that these measures didn't enter into our model at all, the 6-minute walk, any of these other measures, but we saw this very strong correlation for where we estimated someone in their disease age and their observed values on these other measures as well.
Okay, thank you.
Melanie, any more questions for Melanie? Okay, so I have one question for you, Melanie. Since designing clinical trials for rare disease is so complicated, and of course you explained beautifully how you managed to design a clinical trial in collaboration with clinicians, of course, at the NIH. What other suggestions would you have for clinicians to collaborate with statisticians and making sure that the clinical trial is defined as further as possible, considering, of course, patient outcomes that are, of course, in line with the disease itself. So how would you suggest to start the collaboration with clinicians?
Yeah, I think, you know, part of your question is exactly what I would say, that you do need a statistician and to work closely with a statistician. The other aspect of this, I think, that goes hand in hand, as I mentioned, was doing natural history studies to really be able to understand how the endpoints progressed and the variability of each of the endpoints. But the thing I didn't talk about today, which I think is a whole nother topic, and is what we call clinical trial simulation. And it was used for all of this. But what that essentially means is we simulate the clinical trial. We simulate the data that we expect to go in, what we think that will look like, and we get average operating characteristics out of it. We can understand power, as I showed today. So I think natural history studies together with this clinical trial simulation to actually simulate your trial, understand how it's going to work before you actually run it in real life. You know, we always say simulate millions of patients before you enroll your first real one, so that you can really have a good understanding of how your clinical trial is going to run. And I think that's also that's also invaluable. Another thing I'll say that I didn't mention here, and we've talked about building it into this trial, but haven't added it yet, is we do a lot of adaptive clinical trials. And I think these can be extremely beneficial in rare diseases where your patient population is limited. So potentially adding in interim analyses to check, have we already demonstrated benefit at, say, 1 year? Have we demonstrated benefit at 1.5 years? So potentially you could have smaller sample sizes, enroll less, because there is a lot of uncertainty into what treatment effect you expect to see. So I would also say, clinical trial simulation, and also consider adaptations or frequent interim analyses where you could potentially stop early if you do have that high treatment effect, or potentially stop early if the trial is showing no benefit at all. We don't want to waste patients' time. We don't want to waste resources on treatments that aren't working.
Say, Melanie, a lot of creativity and good use of limited data in rare disease, correct?
Yes, yep. I think a lot of people think that rare diseases are small sample sizes, so these should be easier studies to run. And I actually always say, this is exactly when you need a statistician, because this is when you need to be creative and more innovative, and you need to be as efficient as possible. So these are one of the hardest clinical trials to run, I think.
Is there anyone just interested in asking a question for Melanie?
I think we can wrap up, perhaps.
Great. Thank you very much, Melanie. Thank you, everyone. Please join me in thanking Melanie. It was really an interesting presentation. I'm sure extremely helpful for other rare, slowly progressive diseases as well. It has been a pleasure. So I would like to remind everyone that this webinar will be available on the EURO-NMD website and the YouTube channel as well. And last note, I would like to remind everyone that if you are interested in presenting a webinar, you can contact, of course, Antonio Atalaya at EURO-NMD. And if you are a patient representative and you believe that there is a webinar that could be of interest for the community of researchers and clinicians in your disease, please get in touch with the Patient Advisory Board. You will find contact details in our website. Thank you again, Melanie. It has been a pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys again. And please, if a question comes up afterwards, the sponsors have my email, so please feel free to email me if you come up with a question later on. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. Bye now.
Bye.